Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly in one of our very rare breaking news segments on Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
So, up for today, released today, the following document, memorandum for the head of the criminal division from the DAG, the Deputy Attorney General, subject matter, guidelines for investigations and enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Matt, this is the result of President Trump's February 10 executive order suspending investigation and enforcement of the FCPA. And our initial thoughts on this, I think, are, or my wife might say, what's the big deal? But maybe that's the big deal. So what are your initial thoughts?
I am intrigued, but not terribly overwhelmed or shocked by anything that's in here. This, to be clear, when President Trump announced the pause in FCPA enforcement, he said it would be paused at least for 6 months while they reevaluate FCPA enforcement posture in the United States and issue new policy priorities and whatnot. This is that document, and it is out in less than 4 months. So I will give Deputy AG Todd Blanche credit. He got something done ahead of schedule and maybe under budget. But when you look at the guts of what he's talking about, how FCPA enforcement will change, which it will, I think for most anti-corruption compliance officers at large organizations, at the end of the day, I'm not sure this really changes much of anything about how you would run your program, how you're going to talk about the importance of anti-corruption. Maybe if you are a corporate defense lawyer or in the white collar world, you might have some changes in how you handle an actual FCPA enforcement case. But let's not kid ourselves. Everybody knew that there's going to be a lot less enforcement of the FCPA. I think that is reflected here. I also thought the FCPA would not go away entirely. That is the case here. And what you do, the policies you have, the controls you want to implement, the training you give to employees, I don't think any of that is going to change either, because FCPA compliance is still an important thing, and it is still only one of multiple things a chief ethics and compliance officer has to worry about. So we can get into the details, Tom, and we should, but I think at the end of the day, how is this going to change what you were doing about anti-corruption compliance last week or last month or last year? Probably not at all.
Man, the more I think about it, the more I think a big ho-hum is actually one of the key takeaways from this, because, as you said, not much of anything has changed. Perhaps a little tinkering, perhaps some refocus or reprioritization might be a better phrase. We have known since day one, cartels were directly in the side of the FCPA, of this administration. And we've seen that reiterated here in this new FCPA enforcement update. But a couple of points around the focus perhaps on more foreign-based companies to, quote, safeguard fair opportunities for U.S. companies and advance U.S. national security. So I wanted to maybe see if we could split those two apart, because it seemed to me that they are communicating that non-U.S. companies may be more in line of sight of anti-corruption investigation, where bribing foreign officials to obtain profits at the expense of law-abiding companies, including U.S. companies, and depriving U.S. entities of fair access to compete will be factors taken into account. I'm not sure that was specifically articulated before. The other point, and maybe we could drill down a little bit on this, on advancing U.S. national security interests. It doesn't surprise me that U.S. national security interests include extractive resources, but it's perhaps broader and wider than that, like things like infrastructure, things like ports, port security. China has sort of an internal Silk Road transportation system. They've got their Belts and Roads program that I think has universally been seen as rife with corruption, so that there could be infrastructure that could also be national security. But maybe we can start with the U.S. business interest if a foreign company hurts or damages U.S. business interests, do you think that is something that they may take a more closer look at?
That's always been the cynical assumption. I don't think it's entirely wrong. Although, if you read into the text of this memo from Deputy AG Blanche, there's a lot of ambiguity about what he's actually talking about here. Now, I have long thought that they would not abolish FCPA enforcement because, at the least, it's a nifty tool for the Trump administration to use against foreign companies to pressure foreign governments that Trump does not like. So why would you totally abolish FCPA enforcement? And let's not forget that I think a majority of FCPA enforcement actions over the years, and certainly most of the big ones, come against foreign companies that do have some sort of exposure to U.S. markets. But when Blanche talks about U.S. business interests that I guess might get boxed out because of corruption, I'm still skeptical about what do you actually mean there? Because part of what the memo says, and I'll read this out, the department's FCPA enforcement will seek to vindicate these U.S. interests not by focusing on particular individuals or companies on the basis of their nationality, but identifying and prioritizing the investigation and prosecution of conduct that most undermines the principles of U.S. interests. So that's where he's saying, actually, no, we're not just going to go after foreign businesses. Now, frankly, I don't believe him there. I don't. Because let's say, for example, that this is all about harm to U.S. business interests. So if I am U.S. business company A and I bribe my way into a lucrative foreign business overseas somewhere, a foreign country overseas, and I violated the FCPA, and therefore I have also boxed out U.S. business companies B, C, and D, who can no longer get a contract in that country because I bribed my way to do it, I have harmed the competitive interests of those U.S. businesses. So shouldn't I be facing FCPA prosecution? Yes, I would say. And that is why bribery is such a terrible crime and corruption is bad and it does have real victims, but it just has victims that are 1 degree removed away from the actual transaction. But I, frankly, like I said before, I just don't believe Todd Blanche when he says we're going to enforce against violations that harm U.S. business interests. I think they're going to interpret that very narrowly to say we're only going to do it against foreigners in countries we don't like, because that's what Trump is talking about. That is his whole MO with all of his foreign policy. Now, that said, I would say if you are a foreign business and you're listed on U.S. exchanges, or you have a U.S. subsidiary, or you do dollar-denominated transactions through the U.S. financial system, sure, if you're a minister of whatever or your prime minister does not agree with Donald Trump on something like tariffs, would Trump then tell the deputy AG and the Justice Department, please go investigate their companies for FCPA violations? Yeah, of course he would. I don't know that they actually would, but they might. But Tom, I am somewhat skeptical about what do we mean harming U.S. business interests? Or is there going to be favoritism? If you are company A, but you're a big donor to Trump, are they going to look the other way? If you're a big donor to Donald Trump and your company B, C, or D, and you don't like company A from the United States that boxed you out because of bribery, then are they going to bring FCPA investigations? They might. You can't put anything past Donald Trump and what he would want. So I'm still very confused about who's actually going to face enforcement here. The only thing that I do wonder a little bit more clearly on is when we talk about strategic national interests, I actually take it to mean that Trump and the administration will not prosecute U.S. companies for paying bribes to win business that further advances what Donald Trump wants around the world. For example, the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has been talking about allowing the U.S. to extract rare earths there, which the Congo does have, in exchange for military support or some other national security support against Congolese rebels who are fighting the government. Now, this is the Congo. Is that rife with corruption? Absolutely. If you are a U.S. mining company trying to get extraction rights in the Congo, are you going to be hit up for a shakedown? Totally. Come on. We all know that. But Is the department going to turn a blind eye to that because we really need these rare earths because China is cutting them off? Maybe. What about canals or ports, which the administration has brought up before? They mentioned that in the FCPA pause. So it's really hard for me to understand, what are we seriously going to look at and enforce for the FCPA? And how are we just kind of throwing garlands and nice flowers around what's really going to go on, which is turning away from business interests or commercial interests that Trump might want to see. And therefore, even if it's rife with corruption, we're not going to do it. That's what the Justice Department's stance is going to be. We can't really tell from this memo, and we're going to have to wait and see.
Well, I think we've said several times over the course of this year, the proof's going to be in the pudding, and it will certainly be there. But I just read this as a direct sight on foreign companies. And if U.S. company A cuts out U.S. companies B, C, and E, or B, C, and D and E, to say perhaps more correctly, I think they're going to be much more concerned about the foreign company somewhere else who does that.
Yeah.
You think so? In the national security section C, they specifically mentioned the critical minerals. You talked about that. Deepwater ports, I guess that means the Panama Canal, or other key infrastructure or assets. Do you think that will cause the government to maybe explore these areas more deeply, or are they just going to sit back and wait for whistleblowers to come to the DOJ?
As a practical matter, given that the FCPA enforcement unit has been cut in half in personnel, I think they'll have to wait a lot on whistleblowers. Maybe an interesting way to analyze this memo is to consider what was not said in it. Nothing said about the incentive program that the criminal division launched last year. Too much fanfare. I assume it's still there. Nothing said about count as a bribery recipient. We're still, I presume, if it's a state-owned company or some other sort of instrumentality, we've always defined that very broadly in FCPA enforcement. Nothing there in this memo saying we're now going to change that and tailor it more narrowly. Nothing said about what counts as an effective compliance program, which is a different piece of guidance, and maybe they will amend that, maybe they won't. I don't know, but it's not mentioned here. Honestly, Tom, I'm thinking more like this is telling us where the criminal division won't really care about bribery and corruption. So maybe if you're in extracting rare earths, or you're a developer of ports or missile defense systems, and you're competing for lucrative contracts there, maybe that will or won't get more attention. But if you're selling computer software to the education ministry of wherever in a corrupt country, and you're going to pay a bribe, this memo tells me that the department's not going to care less about that. The one issue I would wonder about is not the hard national security interests around the ports or mineral extraction or something like that. What about sensitive technology like artificial intelligence? Because that could very easily be something that you'd want to, I don't know, maybe sell to an important customer, but they want a bribe. If you're advancing U.S. interests by selling your U.S. AI to foreign companies, does that mean that they won't care in the Justice Department if you pay a bribe? Will they be looking at foreign companies that are paying bribes but are in artificial intelligence? What about valuable things like pharmaceuticals? If we ever have another pandemic, suddenly that would certainly be a national security interest, I think. Unless RFK gets to decide that pandemics aren't something we worry about anymore. I'm not sure.
But I think he's already decided that.
That could be. But, if we want to think expansively about what counts as a national security interest, it could take us to some pretty interesting places. The easy low-hanging fruit is the rare earths, the mining, the oil field services, the port construction, things like that. But what else might prosecutors construe as a national security item or field or interest where they're going to pay more attention to bribery and corruption? I don't know.
There's a couple of other points that I thought were worth mentioning. One is the mention of FCPA, or the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which of course criminalizes the demand side of foreign bribery. And they said that prosecutors should consider whether specific and identifiable U.S. entities or individuals have been harmed by foreign officials' demand for bribes. So perhaps they may use this as a cudgel The second thing is around laws in other countries and other law enforcement outside the United States. So it says FCPA prosecutors should also consider the likelihood that an appropriate foreign law enforcement authority is willing and able to investigate and prosecute the same misconduct, which seems to indicate that they may allow or look to partners in other jurisdictions to bring claims as well.
I do think that latter one. I think that's a good idea, because clearly if, the other country couldn't care less to enforce its own anti-corruption laws, that sends a message that why should I care if you don't care about what's going on in your own house? I see why that might be a valid statement. And I would like other jurisdictions, including ours, to take anti-corruption seriously. Tom, your point about the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, that is something that I have wondered about myself as a practical matter for compliance teams. Should you have a policy just saying that if an employee receives a request for a bribe from a foreign government official, should that employee report it to you? And I've always said, yes, you absolutely should, so that you have these FCPA allegations in your back pocket, frankly, as a negotiating tactic. That, Mr. Prosecutor, why don't you go easy on my FCPA violation, because I'll be able to cooperate with you now on these FCPA prosecutions, and now you can indict these foreign government officials, especially if it's a country that Donald Trump doesn't like today. That could be very valuable currency. So there are ways that compliance officers should study this policy, this pronouncement, consider its implications, and then think through, should you amend or tailor any of your own anti-corruption policies, such as the FCPA reporting requirement for employees. That's my favorite one, but there might be others. But, what are you supposed to do with this, compliance officer who's listening? It's things like that. Take this policy pronouncement, think about what it might mean and how you might tailor your program. Although, getting back to what we said at the start, Tom, I think in the end, you'll find you don't really want to change much of what your program does, but there might be changes around the edges.
Matt, I think not only are we going to be able to revisit this memo and perhaps other memorandum, but we may have more questions.
Tom, can I sneak in one more interesting item that I would love to have some insight to?
Sure.
I am curious, how will the Securities and Exchange take this policy pronouncement and incorporate any of it into their own thinking? Let's remember that always it's the books and records that really get a lot of companies that bollocksed up. But for example, if the Justice Department is now saying it's really only going to prosecute or pursue cases where specific identifiable U.S. entities are the clear victims here. What do they say? The exact phrase is, this has resulted in economic injury to specific and identifiable American companies or individuals. Now, that's the Justice Department standard. How would that work in civil enforcement at the SEC? Because it's often the case that the true victims of corruption on the civil side are somebody else. It's not clear. The investor doesn't suffer from it really, because you're winning more business through corrupt actions, but you are enjoying higher revenue and income per share. But everybody else who got boxed out, all the other investors and all the other companies, are the losers, but you can't easily quantify that. So that's one example of what I mean, is that how will the enforcement director at the Securities and Exchange Commission take this policy stance from the Justice Department and think about it and apply it? What does that mean for SOX controls? What does that mean for testing? What does it mean for all the other stuff that can also still tie a company into knots? And that's not clear to me. And also, as a practical matter, they've cut the SEC enforcement down to bare bone and then broke the bones after that too. So we still have a lot of not much enforcement capability there. But that's my last big thing. We can talk about it some other day, but there's just a lot for people to think about here.
I would just say that part of the analysis the DOJ will use is proven and sophisticated efforts to conceal bribe payments and fraudulent conduct of furtherance of a bribery scheme. And to the extent that happens in books and records or overriding or completely bypassing internal controls, perhaps that might be something. But I think the SEC will probably take a different perspective because their enforcement targets are different.
We shall see. It would be nice for the SEC at some point to give a substantive speech on this. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But then again, it's a practical matter. They've already laid off 16% of their staff with more to come. So who knows what might go on there. But lots to think about.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.